In this video, we're going to talk about recovering from trauma. Judith Herman, who is an MD, wrote a book in the 1990s called Trauma and Recovery. In it, she covered stages that people typically go through when they are recovering from post-traumatic stress and trauma. The stages are safety, remembrance and mourning, and reconnection. Now, these aren't linear where you do step 1 and then you do step 2 and you do step 3 and you're all done. There's a flow to it. And sometimes we start in safety and we may move into the other stages, but we may come back to safety at times too. As a trauma survivor, what makes me feel safe today or what coping skills I'm using today, they might not last forever. So I may have to go back to safety. Maybe something happens in my life that is triggering or makes me a little bit more vulnerable. Then I might go back and find that stability once again. So let's start with safety. Safety means exactly what it sounds like. It's trying to find a way that you can recapture your safety. Trauma survivors, regardless of the trauma, it could have been a car accident, it could have been a medical procedure, it could have been child abuse. But during that time, during that trauma, there was no safety. And with the way that the brain processes trauma, the brain will continue to perceive innocuous environments, safe people that are not going to hurt you, as possibly people that are going to harm you. It cannot differentiate between something that's a threat and something that isn't a threat. And so you're always feeling as if you are not safe. So when people do not feel safe, and when they are experiencing post-traumatic stress symptoms such as hypervigilance and nightmares and numbing, dissociation, what happens is they start to cope with that. And oftentimes those coping skills include things like cutting, substance use, suicidal ideation. When we're in the safety stage, what we start to do is we start to identify those kinds of behaviors with our trauma. We start kind of making the connection that maybe one is causing the other. We also just start understanding when we do those behaviors. Sometimes you'll hear the word trigger. And what that refers to is something in our environment, sound, sight, taste, touch, or smell, that triggers our brain into thinking that we are threatened. So maybe you're in an office with a service provider and it's their gender. Maybe you are at a party and there's a candle burning and it's the scent. Whatever it is, it tricks you into thinking that you're being threatened. And a lot of things can happen in that time because your body's going to react to it in a way to keep you safe. And that could be that I'm going to react by dissociating. I check out, I disconnect from my present, and I go somewhere else. And I have no control over that. I may feel like I want to numb all my feelings and not feel them, and so I shut down. And so what people do when they are triggered is when those behaviors happen. They pick up and they use, they harm themselves, they participate in risky behavior. So part of safety is being able to identify what situations you might be going into that could be triggering. So perhaps you know that you are going to have to participate in a court proceeding. And you know that when you sit in court, it's going to be triggering to you for a variety of reasons. That you may start feeling shame. You might have fear. You might have anxiety, and you know how difficult that is when you have those feelings, that they're overwhelming. And so in safety stage, you figure out prior to that court hearing what you're going to do so that you can make it through and not have to drink or use afterwards, or drink and use before. You learn coping skills, you learn strategies that help you get through just everyday happenings and events. I had a friend once who she was triggered by the sound of keys on somebody's belt because she had been sexually abused by somebody that wore keys. And whenever she would hear something like that, similar to that, she would dissociate, and she would dissociate for a really long time. It's called losing time, where you come out of it and you don't remember what happened. So it was very frightening, and you can understand how that would interfere on her being able to have relationships, having a job, going to school. But she worked with a really great therapist, and they were able to identify that was one of her triggers. Another trigger was when she had to meet a deadline and how difficult that was, and that she'd go into this panic, and that would lead to dissociation. Now, what she had done before to cope with that is she would cut herself because she knew that that would stop the dissociation. It worked. But what her therapist did is taught her some coping strategies and things to do. And maybe it's a rubber band that she just snaps on her wrist, but it would stop the dissociation. So that's what safety is. We decrease the dangerous behaviors, the risky behaviors, the behaviors that we end up spiraling into shame about, and we increase positive behaviors. And we start to understand the impact of trauma on our life. And that is why these videos are so important. Big part of healing and going through the stages of recovery is understanding and being educated. Knowledge is power. And when you watch videos, when you read a book, when you talk to a professional about PTSD, you gain more power because you understand why you are reacting the way you are reacting, and you have the power to change it. So that's safety. The next stage is remembrance and mourning. Oftentimes, trauma is going to interfere with your ability to remember what happened. This is very common. Some people will have memories that are maybe just bits and pictures. That's what I have. I have like flashes of photographs, but I don't have anything in between. I don't really know what happened before or what happened after, but I have a photo in my mind of just like a still shot. And also what I remember is the smell and the sound. So some people just have these pieces of memory. Other people will just know that something happened, but they have no memory at all. And you can imagine how frustrating that would be. So remembrance is kind of a process, and people do this oftentimes with a therapist who has been trained in techniques to help people remember and recall. And some people will recover and live a life of joy and not recover, the entire memory. It's not that it is mandatory for you to have your full memory back in order to recover. But some folks find it helpful because then they can create a narrative, and it's kind of validating that this did happen to me. And they need that piece in order to move forward and through it. If they are able to remember, or they are able to work through what happened and acknowledge what happened and create that story or narrative, oftentimes what follows is grief and mourning. This too is normal. In our culture, we don't give a lot of attention to grief. Even when people, we lose people that we love, we sometimes get like 3 days off work, and we plan a funeral, and we're supposed to grieve in this very short period of time. And everybody that has lost someone knows that that isn't how grief works, that it ebbs and it flows and it shows up at times that we would have never imagined. And trauma is the same way. There's so much to grieve from trauma. In my own grieving process, I was grieving the parents that I wish that I would have had, the childhood that I wish I would have had. I was grieving opportunities that I missed. I was grieving the idea and the feeling of safety, because those things just seemed like they were gone and I would never have them. If you add in other complications, other mental health illnesses, substance use, there's other losses that follow as well. So what's important in this stage is to feel that, to acknowledge it, and to understand it. Oftentimes we might say that we're depressed, when really what we're doing is we're grieving. And that's a healthy thing. It's a healthy thing to cry and to mourn. And you should allow yourself the opportunity to do that. And then the last stage is reconnection. When Judith Herman talks about this in her book, she talks about trauma being a process of disconnection. So you disconnect from your ability to feel because you're numbing and shutting down. You disconnect from your body. You disconnect spiritually. You disconnect from people and community and sense of self. So what you want to do is you want to do the opposite of that in recovery, where you're reconnecting. One part of that reconnection is acceptance. And acceptance, actually, we should call it, many people call it radical acceptance, because accepting something that was done to you that is so horrific is a radical idea. Radical acceptance is all about, again, understanding the impact that the trauma had on you and deciding that it's not going to have the power over you as it did before. So you may still feel things like grief and disappointment, but you don't get stuck. You don't get stuck in bitterness and anger. And you no longer put all your energy into changing the past. You no longer put energy into punishing yourself. You stop the self-talk that says, I should have. I wish I would have. Why did this happen to me? What did I do to deserve this? That talk doesn't exist anymore. Or if it does, it's a fleeting thought, it's your first thought, and you catch it. And you let it go. What acceptance is not, is it's not condoning what happened in any way. It's very similar to forgiveness and letting go. It's also about control. That you no longer in a place where you want to control what happened. And that, I know that sounds odd because you can't control something that was in the past, but we do try to do that. And we give that up. And you'll understand this because I think we're all going through this right now with the pandemic. That most of what is happening in the world, we have no control over. So acceptance, radical acceptance, is recognizing that and letting go of the part that we can't control. Many people in recovery use a prayer. It's called the Serenity Prayer. It's not a religious prayer, and we actually don't even know who wrote it. But the prayer goes like this. God, help me accept the things that I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. It's about letting go of those things that we cannot change. That usually includes people. And that is where we get into radical acceptance and serenity. So radical acceptance is also part of the reconnection through something that Judith Herman calls the survivor mission. And survivor mission is when you take the thing that happened to you, the horrible experience, and you transform it into something that can have a positive impact. It's moving your identity from being a victim to a survivor to maybe a thriver. And when Judith Herman talks about this, she talks about survivor missions, and that these missions can be very formalized, where you take your experience and perhaps you use it to change legislation or policy. You take your lived experience and you talk to a reporter so that you can build awareness around a particular kind of violence. My survivor mission is sitting in here today and doing this video. And I would not be able to do that if I had not experienced what I experienced as a survivor. So it allows me to help people. It changes the power, it changes the narrative. I'm able to give it meaning and do something useful with it. And I think it's important to mention survivor mission because oftentimes service providers do not always talk to people about survivor missions and ask the question, which is, how would you like to use your experience to impact change? How would you like to use your experience to help another person? Because it doesn't always have to be that you're getting up in front of a video. It can also be reaching your hand out just to your neighbor, your coworker, a friend, and using your lived experience to help them feel less alone. So it's important whether you identify yourself as a survivor or a service provider, that these stages are something that we want to talk to people about. We want them to normalize some of the things that they are going through and understand that oftentimes self-destructive behaviors are coping skills, that there's always hope that they're going to get through that and they're going to find new ways to live and to cope, and that they can actually use that horrific experience or experiences, adversity, and help make our community safer or better. So those are the 3 stages of recovering from trauma. And I think it's important to note the power behind being able to move through those stages, to be able to heal, to be able to grow, to the point where you are using your lived experience that before was destroying your life to actually do good and to build hope.